Have you ever wondered what it would be like to wake up on a peaceful medieval morning only to face an army of Viking warriors ready to raid your village? This was the harsh reality for many Europeans of that era. But would you have any chance of surviving these incursions? In today's video, we delve into history to uncover why you probably wouldn't. Stay until the end to understand the brutal and fascinating details of this Viking era of terror. In the late 8th century, a new and formidable power emerged from the cold, inhospitable lands of northern Europe, the Vikings from the regions we now know as Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. These Norse warriors, known for their brutality and naval prowess, began a series of raids that left a deep mark on European history. The Viking raids officially began in 793 with the infamous attack on the Lindisfarne Monastery on the northeast coast of England. This attack was a shock to the Christian world at the time. Monasteries, typically peaceful and poorly defended, were ideal targets full of riches and supplies. The Vikings' brutality in looting these sacred places spread terror throughout Europe. But why did the Vikings start these raids? There are several theories. Some historians believe that overpopulation and resource scarcity in the Norse lands forced the Vikings to seek new lands and wealth. Others point to technological advances like the development of the longships, the swift and agile Viking ships, that enabled long voyages and surprise attacks. Additionally, the fragmented political structure of Europe at the time made it an easy target. The raids were not limited to England. The Vikings quickly expanded their attacks to Ireland, Scotland, France, and even the Iberian Peninsula. No coast seemed safe. They sailed up rivers, penetrating deep into Europe, attacking cities, villages, and monasteries. Their ability to strike quickly and disappear before an effective defense could be organized made them virtually invincible. The Vikings were not just raiders but also explorers and colonizers. They established settlements in Greenland, Iceland, and even in the Americas long before Columbus. These settlements often started as winter camps to facilitate future raids, but some became permanent colonies. Understanding the historical context of the Viking raids helps us appreciate the magnitude of the threat these warriors posed. They were not simply barbarians in search of loot but a complex and strategic force that shaped medieval European history in profound and lasting ways. Viking attack methods. The Vikings were masters of surprise attacks, using methods that gave them a significant advantage over unsuspecting populations. Their ability to execute quick and devastating attacks was a combination of naval skills, smart military tactics, and a deep knowledge of the terrain. Longships, the famous Viking ships, were key to their success. These long and narrow ships were designed for speed and agility. With shallow drafts, they could navigate both deep waters and shallow rivers, allowing Vikings to reach places inaccessible to other types of ships. Equipped with oars and sails, the longships could move quickly, enabling surprise attacks anywhere along the coast. Attacks usually began before dawn when villages were at their most vulnerable. The Vikings would land silently, using the darkness to approach undetected. At the first light, the Viking fury was unleashed. With sharp weapons and fierce brutality, they attacked quickly, looting and burning everything in their path. The speed and precision of Viking attacks were impressive. They knew exactly what to look for: treasures, supplies, and slaves. Monasteries, often housing considerable wealth and poorly defended, were frequent targets. Viking brutality spared no one. Clergy, villagers, men, women, and children were all targets. This indiscriminate violence spread terror and the fame of the Vikings throughout Europe. The Vikings were also shrewd strategists. They chose their targets based on vulnerability and potential wealth. They observed trade routes and local defenses before attacking, ensuring their raids were as profitable as possible. Moreover, the reputation of Viking ferocity often caused villages to surrender or flee at the first sign of an attack, making their incursions even easier. After the attack, the Vikings rarely stayed long. Laden with loot and prisoners, they quickly returned to their ships and disappeared into the waters, leaving behind burning villages and devastated communities. This efficient modus operandi allowed them to carry out multiple attacks in a single season, maximizing their gains and minimizing risks. The Viking attack methods were not just brutal but also extremely effective. Their ability to move quickly, strike with ferocity, and disappear without a trace made them a constant and unpredictable threat. This combination of military tactics and psychological terror ensured that wherever the Vikings went, they left a trail of destruction and fear. Life in a medieval village. Life in a medieval European village was marked by simplicity, community, and a constant struggle for survival. Villages were usually small, housing a few dozen to a few hundred people, and most activities revolved around agriculture and subsistence. Medieval villages were often situated in strategic locations such as near rivers or fertile lands. At the center of the village was usually a church, serving as the spiritual and social heart of the community. Around the church were the villagers' homes, made of simple materials like wood, mud, and straw. These homes were modest, often consisting of a single room that served as a living room, kitchen, and bedroom. The main economic activity of medieval villages was agriculture. Peasants worked the lands around the village, growing cereals like wheat, barley, and rye, as well as vegetables. The work was exhausting and followed the rhythm of the seasons, plowing and planting in the spring, tending the crops in the summer, and harvesting in the fall. In the winter, the work focused on repairs and preparation for the next planting season. In addition to agriculture, there were some complementary activities. Raising animals like chickens, pigs, and sheep provided meat, eggs, and wool. Artisans and blacksmiths produced essential tools and utensils for everyday life. Local markets allowed villagers to obtain goods they could not produce themselves. Social life in medieval villages centered on community and the church. Religion played a crucial role, with the church organizing festivals, masses, and events that brought everyone together. The liturgical calendar, with its feasts and celebrations, marked the rhythm of the year. Villages were also places of strong interdependence. Villagers worked together in the fields, helped each other build and repair homes, and shared resources during times of need. This collaboration was essential for survival in a world where nature and circumstances could be unforgiving. Most medieval villages did not have significant fortifications. Defenses were usually limited to wooden palisades or ditches, if they existed at all. This made villages extremely vulnerable to invaders like the Vikings. When rumors of raids spread, villagers might try to hide in forests or seek refuge in nearby forts or castles if any were available. Life in a medieval village was full of challenges. Infant mortality was high, and diseases like plague, smallpox, and influenza could decimate populations. Sanitary conditions were poor, and food, while generally sufficient for survival, could be monotonous and of low nutritional quality. Villagers also faced climatic challenges. Harsh winters could mean food and fuel shortages, and dry summers could ruin crops. Additionally, political instability and frequent wars in medieval Europe added an extra layer of uncertainty and danger. Living in a medieval village meant facing a hard existence but also being part of a united community. The simplicity of daily life, the interdependence among villagers, and the constant presence of the church shaped a life of hard work, faith, and resilience. However, this relative peace could be brutally interrupted by external invaders like the Vikings, turning the daily struggle for survival into a nightmare of destruction and terror. The brutality of the attacks. The brutality of Viking attacks left an indelible mark on the communities targeted by these incursions. The speed and violence of the Viking attacks left little time for villagers to prepare or react, resulting in massive destruction and loss of life. The Vikings were highly equipped warriors, using a variety of weapons that made their attacks extremely deadly. Sharp swords, heavy axes, spears, and bows were common among the attackers. Axes, in particular, were feared for their ability to cause devastating injuries. In addition to offensive weapons, the Vikings used large shields, often decorated with Norse symbols, which provided effective protection and could be used defensively. Viking attacks were meticulously planned and executed with precision. They approached villages silently in their longships, using the cover of darkness or morning fog. The element of surprise was crucial. They landed quickly and attacked before the villagers had time to organize any defense. This speed and efficiency put the communities at a disadvantage from the start. Psychological terror was a powerful weapon for the Vikings. The sound of war cries and the initial impact of the attacks were enough to spread panic among the villagers. Stories of brutality and violence spread through the attacked regions, increasing the fear. Often, the mere threat of a Viking attack was enough to destabilize a community, causing people to flee and abandon their homes. The Vikings made no distinction between combatants and civilians. Men, women, children, and the elderly, all were potential targets. The indiscriminate violence was a hallmark of their incursions. Villages were looted, houses burned, and those who resisted were often killed on the spot. This lack of discrimination exacerbated the terror and sense of helplessness among the villagers. After the initial attack, the Vikings systematically looted the village. They took everything of value: gold, silver, jewelry, household items, and anything else that could be transported. Monasteries and churches, often filled with accumulated treasures, were preferred targets. Besides looting, the Vikings often set buildings on fire, leaving behind only ruins and ashes. This not only maximized physical destruction but also destroyed the community's morale and recovery ability. One of the most terrible consequences of Viking attacks was the capture of prisoners to be sold as slaves. Men, women, and children were taken from their lands and transported to slave markets throughout the Norse world and beyond. The brutality did not end with the attack. Captives faced a life of servitude, hard labor, and inhumane conditions. The loss of family members and community members to slavery added a deep layer of trauma and desolation. Despite the overwhelming brutality, many communities showed remarkable resilience. After the attacks, survivors attempted to rebuild their lives, re-erect their homes, and replant their crops. However, the constant fear of future attacks meant that peace and stability were often fleeting. The brutality of Viking attacks cannot be underestimated. They combined physical strength, sophisticated war tactics, and psychological terror that devastated communities. The indiscriminate violence, looting, and slavery left deep scars not only on the physical fabric of villages but also on the souls of those who survived. Understanding this brutality helps us appreciate the resilience of medieval communities and the depth of the impact that Viking incursions had on European history. Survival during and after the attacks. Surviving a Viking attack and dealing with its aftermath was an incredibly challenging task for medieval communities. The brutality of the attacks and the devastation left behind meant that villagers needed resilience, ingenuity, and luck to continue living after such events. When the first signs of a Viking attack were perceived, ships on the horizon, the sound of oars in the water, or war cries, villagers had very little time to react. Immediate options for trying to survive included fleeing to forests or high ground where they could hide among the trees or in caves. The density of forests could provide some degree of protection from attackers. Some sought refuge in churches or monasteries, believing that the Vikings would respect sacred places. Unfortunately, this tactic rarely worked, as the Vikings often looted these places for treasures. In some villages, villagers had underground hideouts or cellars where they could shelter during an attack. These hideouts offered some temporary safety but did not guarantee long-term protection. In rare cases, groups of villagers tried to organize an improvised defense using agricultural tools as weapons. However, these defenses were often insufficient against the well-armed and trained Viking warriors. Once the Vikings left, the difficulties were far from over. The destruction left behind meant that villagers faced a daily struggle to rebuild their lives. Burned and destroyed houses needed to be rebuilt. Villagers used available materials like wood and mud to re-erect their homes. This process could take weeks or months, during which many villagers were left without adequate shelter. With crops destroyed and supplies looted, hunger was a real threat. Villagers depended on hunting, fishing, and gathering wild foods to survive until new crops could be planted. Often, neighbors and nearby communities helped by sharing resources. The wounded needed basic medical care, often provided by local healers or family members. Without advanced medical knowledge, many wounds became infected, and recovery was slow and painful. The psychological impact of a Viking attack was profound. The loss of loved ones, the destruction of homes, and the constant threat of new attacks caused stress and trauma. The community united in religious rituals and ceremonies to try to heal these invisible wounds. The village economy, primarily based on agriculture, needed to be restored. This involved replanting crops, raising new animals, and restoring any destroyed artisanal activities. Villages often relied on fairs and local markets to exchange goods and replenish supplies. Learning from experience, many villages tried to improve their defenses. This could include building palisades, ditches, or watchtowers to alert about future attacks. Cooperation with other villages to create warning and mutual defense networks also became more common. In some cases, villages tried to establish commercial relations or alliances with the Vikings or other local lords to ensure some level of protection. Paying tributes or peace agreements were strategies used to avoid new attacks. The resilience of medieval communities was remarkable. Even after devastating attacks, villagers demonstrated an incredible capacity for recovery. The social networks within the village and religious faith played crucial roles in sustaining moral and emotional support. Religious festivals, ceremonies, and community life helped restore a sense of normality and belonging. Surviving a Viking attack and its aftermath required a combination of luck, ingenuity, and resilience. Medieval villagers faced the destruction of their lives and homes with a determination that allowed the community to rebuild repeatedly. This indomitable spirit is a testament to the human capacity to overcome extreme adversity, even in the face of a formidable threat like the Vikings. Captivity and slavery. Captivity and slavery were brutal and common realities for many who fell into Viking hands during their raids. This aspect of Viking incursions was as devastating as the looting and destruction, leaving deep scars on affected communities. When the Vikings invaded a village, in addition to looting and destroying, they captured men, women, and children. These people were taken as prisoners and forced to march to the Viking ships, often tied up or under constant guard to prevent escape attempts. The captives faced long and arduous journeys back to Norse lands or other destinations where they would be sold as slaves. Life as a slave under the Vikings was extremely harsh. Captives were forced to work under brutal conditions, performing tasks ranging from heavy agricultural labor to domestic services and construction. Strong men were often used as manual laborers, while women and children could be sold as domestic servants or even for darker purposes like sexual exploitation. Slave markets were an integral part of the Viking economy. In cities like Hedeby, Ribe, and Birka, large markets gathered merchants from various parts of the world, including other Scandinavians, Europeans, and even Arab traders. In these markets, captives were sold to the highest bidder. The Vikings preferred captives who were young and healthy, as they had greater value and a longer expected useful life in labor. Slavery did not just mean hard work, it also involved a complete loss of freedom and rights. Slaves had no autonomy and were considered property of their owners. They were often mistreated, given little food and care, and lived under constant threat of violence. Living conditions were unsanitary and dangerous, and many slaves did not survive long due to poor conditions and physical abuse. Hope for escape was minimal. Captives were taken to foreign lands where they did not know the language or the terrain, making escape nearly impossible. Additionally, strict surveillance and the threat of severe punishments discouraged escape attempts. However, some stories of courage and resilience emerge with slaves managing to escape and return to their homelands, although these cases were rare. The psychological effects of captivity and slavery were devastating. The abrupt separation from family, friends, and community, combined with the constant threat of violence and poor living conditions, left deep scars. Many captives never fully recovered from the trauma of their experiences, even if they eventually gained their freedom. Despite the brutality of this system, there were some rare opportunities for slaves. In some circumstances, slaves who demonstrated loyalty or exceptional skills could be freed by their owners and even integrate into Viking society. Some could eventually gain their freedom and thrive, but these stories were exceptions in a sea of suffering. Captivity and slavery by the Vikings were not just a cruel practice but also an economic and social strategy that significantly contributed to the wealth and power of Norse societies. By capturing people and using them as commodities, the Vikings not only destroyed communities but also economically exploited their victims in a ruthless manner. The reality of captivity and slavery in Viking incursions is a grim reminder of the brutality and complexity of these invasions. More than just raiders, the Vikings were also traders in human lives, perpetuating a cycle of violence and exploitation that deeply marked medieval European history. Cycle of terror and destruction. The cycle of terror and destruction caused by Viking incursions was a devastating process that left deep marks on medieval European societies. This cycle was not limited to isolated attacks, rather, it was continuous and systematic, creating an atmosphere of constant fear and instability. Viking attacks typically began in the spring when the weather improved, and the seas became navigable. The swift and agile Viking longships allowed them to attack coastal villages and riverside towns with ease. The speed of these ships and the Vikings' ability to navigate shallow waters meant that almost no place was out of their reach. The first signs of an imminent attack often generated panic in the communities. Residents of coastal villages kept watch for any sign of approaching ships. The mere sight of a longship on the horizon was enough to throw an entire community into despair. Often, people fled inland, abandoning their homes and belongings in the hope of escaping the violence. When the Vikings attacked, the destruction was swift and relentless. Houses were burned, churches and monasteries looted, and people were killed or captured to be sold as slaves. The brutality of the attacks left little room for resistance. Those who tried to defend their villages were often massacred, and the survivors were left to deal with the devastation. After an attack, recovery was slow and painful. Villages had to be rebuilt, crops replanted, and losses accounted for. However, the threat of new attacks loomed constantly. The Vikings rarely attacked only once. They returned repeatedly to the same areas, especially if they had found great wealth previously. This created a continuous cycle of destruction, recovery, and renewed terror. This cycle of terror was not just physical but also psychological. The constant fear of Viking attacks deeply affected the morale of communities. The uncertainty about when and where the Vikings would strike again kept people in a state of constant alert and anxiety. The psychological impact of living under the threat of continuous violence was immense, affecting all spheres of daily life. The economy of the affected regions also suffered tremendously. Trade and agriculture were disrupted, and trade routes became dangerous. Merchants hesitated to travel through frequently attacked areas, and farmers faced the destruction of their crops and the loss of livestock. This led to a shortage of food and resources, further exacerbating the suffering of communities. Local authorities, often powerless to stop the attacks, tried various strategies to deal with the Viking threat. Some villages and towns began building fortifications and establishing permanent guards to try to protect their communities. In some cases, local leaders paid tributes to the Vikings in the hope of avoiding future attacks. These strategies, however, were rarely effective in the long term. The response of communities varied. Some villages tried to organize better for defense, building improvised fortifications and forming militias. Others tried to negotiate with the Vikings, offering tributes in the hope of being spared. In some cases, local leaders tried to form alliances with other lords to create a more robust defense. However, the effectiveness of these measures was limited, and the Vikings often found ways to circumvent or overcome the defenses. In addition to the direct impact on the attacked communities, the Viking cycle of terror and destruction had broader ramifications. The constant threats and attacks influenced regional politics and economics. Kingdoms and principalities had to spend significant resources on defense against incursions, often leading to alliances and political conflicts. The instability generated by Viking incursions could also weaken kingdoms, making them vulnerable to other threats. Over time, some areas began to develop more effective responses to Viking attacks. Coastal cities began building stronger walls and organizing trained militias to defend against invasions. The church, often a target of Viking attacks, also began investing in defenses and storing its treasures in safer locations. The brutality of Viking attacks and the cycle of terror and destruction they caused left a lasting impact on European societies. The constant threat of attacks forced communities to adapt their defense strategies and develop impressive resilience. However, the legacy of these incursions was a prolonged period of instability and fear that deeply shaped medieval European history. Conclusion. After exploring the brutality and devastating impact of Viking incursions, it becomes clear that surviving these invasions was an almost insurmountable task for medieval communities. The conclusion of this cycle of terror offers a reflection on human resilience, the brutality of war, and the lasting impact of these incursions on European history. The Viking incursions, which began in the late 8th century, left a trail of destruction that spanned over 2 centuries. The combination of surprise attack tactics, superior weaponry, and relentless ferocity made the Vikings a feared force throughout Europe. Coastal villages and riverside towns were particularly vulnerable, suffering repeated attacks that undermined their ability to recover and thrive. The brutality of Viking attacks, characterized by looting, arson, murder, and the capture of slaves, spread a terror that went beyond mere physical loss. The psychological impact of these attacks was profound, leaving communities in a constant state of alert and anxiety. The threat of a Viking attack was enough to destabilize any sense of security, creating a cycle of fear and uncertainty. The response of communities varied from building fortifications to attempts at negotiation with the invaders. However, many of these strategies were insufficient in the face of the determination and skill of the Vikings. The resilience of medieval communities, however, cannot be underestimated. Despite the devastation, villagers rebuilt their lives, re-erected their villages, and sought ways to survive and adapt to the constant threat. The slave trade was an integral part of the Viking economy, and the capture of men, women, and children added an additional layer of horror to the incursions. Captives faced a life of brutal servitude, often in foreign lands, separated from their families and communities. This aspect of Viking incursions illustrates the cruelty and exploitation that accompanied the relentless pursuit of wealth and power. Beyond the immediate impact of the incursions, the long-term repercussions were also significant. The constant threats and attacks forced changes in the social and political structures of affected regions. Kingdoms and principalities had to adapt, investing in defenses and forming alliances to try to contain the Viking threat. The influence of the Vikings on European politics, both directly and indirectly, helped shape the future of Europe. The history of Viking incursions is ultimately a story of survival. It is a narrative that highlights the human capacity to resist and adapt in the face of extreme adversity. Medieval communities faced an unrelenting threat with courage and determination, even when the odds were against them. This spirit of resilience is a testament to human strength in times of crisis. As we reflect on Viking incursions, we must recognize not only the brutality of the invaders but also the incredible capacity for recovery of the victims. The lessons learned during this period of terror and destruction are valuable and resonate to this day. They remind us of the importance of being prepared, adapting to circumstances, and never underestimating the strength of community and cooperation. The conclusion of this narrative is not just an ending but an invitation to reflect on the complexity of human history. The Viking incursions were a dark chapter but also a demonstration of human resilience and ingenuity. Studying this period gives us a deeper understanding of the forces that shaped our world and the lessons we can apply in the present and future.